Hello YouTube. In this video, we're going to be looking at the basics of Liquid and specifically the different types that we have access to in Liquid. Liquid objects can have one of the 5 types available in the Liquid templating language, and those types are either a string, a number, a boolean, a nil, or an array. So let's get into the code and take a look at how we can use each of these types in Liquid.
So getting into types, in Liquid, objects can have one of 5 types. You can have a string, a number, a boolean, nil, or an array. So let me show you first what a string looks like in Liquid. So over here in my code panel, I will create a string. So I'm going to use the assign method, which we will look at in a future Liquid video, but assign basically allows you to create a variable. So I'm going to create a variable. We'll just call it my string, and then I'm going to make that equal to hello world. And then we will close that. Okay, so I've just created a string with my double quotes around the text that I want to be in the string. So if you're creating strings in Liquid, it's just like many programming languages where you surround the value in double quotes to create a string. Now we also have other data types that we can use in Liquid. So string being one, another data type that we can use is the number data type. So if we say assign, and then we create a new variable name, so we'll say my int will equal, and that will be a whole number because it's an integer. So we'll just say 25. And then we can close that. So now we have an integer data type, and we can also create booleans if we want. So we could say assign my bool equal to true. And then we could also have one that's equal to false, right? So you can make it equal to true or false, and that gives it the boolean data type. So data types in Liquid are inferred based on the value that you give to the variable. So if you give the variable a value that's in quotes, it'll take it as a string. If you give the variable a value that is a whole number, it'll take it as an integer. We also have floats, which is another type of number, and that's a number that has a decimal associated with it. So we could say my float, which will equal 25.21. And there's a float. It still falls under the number type, but we can store decimal values if we assign the original value with a decimal. Finally, there's 2 other data types that we can use in Liquid. That's the nil data type. It's a sort of a special empty value data type that is returned when the Liquid code has no results. So if you run your Liquid code and nothing comes back, or you don't get an answer, that will be the nil value. It is not a string. It's not the characters like NIL. It's actually its own value. It's treated as false if you're using it in conditionals. So if you're using it inside of an if statement, it's treated as false. So just know that nil is its own value. So we can say my empty could be equal to nil, right? And it's not the string nil. It's actually its own value, which means empty. The other final data type that we can use is the array data type. And arrays allow us to hold lists of variables of any type. So if we wanted to access items in an array, we can loop through that array, iterate through the array, and access each individual value in that array. And that array holds on to all those values as one variable. Now, we're not going to go into specifics of how we would create arrays because this gets a little bit complicated. In Liquid, you can't really create them off the get-go. They just sort of get generated based on the system that you're using Liquid with. So Shopify will create arrays and send them back to you, and then you can use them in Liquid. But you can't actually create them yourself. You can't initialize them. There's certain ways that you can get around that and sort of split strings up to make arrays and stuff like that. But typically you don't initialize your own arrays in Liquid. You have arrays given to you by whatever framework you're using. liquid with, in this case it would be Shopify, will give you an array, and then you can loop through that array. So if we received an array, let's just say we received a variable called site that has a bunch of users in it. So we could say for every user in the variable called site and those users inside of that variable called site, we're going to take each one of those users, and for each one, so it's assigning each one to this temporary user, let's loop through and get that individual user out of the list. So you would create a for loop like this, which again, we will go into more detail on how to do for loops in Liquid. And then you could just output the user here into the template if you wanted to. And then we would just end our for loop. Okay, so that's how you would, if you had a variable called site that had an object in it of users, which is an array, so this would be an array type, you could say for every user in that user's array, let's assign them to this temporary user variable, and then we can access this user variable. So this will iterate, this will run over and over and over until it gets through each user in this user's array. Okay, so arrays are a bit more complicated, and we'll talk more about those as we get into actually writing Liquid templates using this for syntax to access things inside of an array. So now that we've got all of these different types initialized, we have a string type, we have an integer type, we have a float, which is also a number along with int, so these two sort of fall into the same type. We have our boolean type, which is set to true, and we have our empty type. We could try using some of these in our template. So let's say, for example, we have a paragraph tag, and inside there we'll put the string. So this can be accessed with the double squiggly braces, which again we'll explain more as we get into actually using Liquid. This is just a very easy intro into the different things that you can do in Liquid. So here we have the myString variable, and we surround that in the paragraph tag, and then that will output that variable, so the string value, to our template. So if I save this, there's the hello world, right? And now I don't need to modify this myString variable here. If I want to change this, I just need to actually change what the string value that's given to it up here, right? So I could say this is a string, and if we save that, that's going to update my text that's in my page, because this string variable here is being updated up above where it gets assigned to, and then in my template it'll show that new string value. Okay, and we could also output a number here if we swapped this variable out for my int. So there's our number value. We could also output our boolean value if we put in my bool, and it's going to say true. And again, if I change this to be false and we save that, it will then output false. And we can even check what the value of our myEmpty is. If we save that, it shows nothing, because nil means nothing. Okay, so that's all I wanted to cover with types. I hope that made sense, and that will help you as you move on learning Liquid.
Thanks for sticking with me through another one of my Liquid tutorial videos. If you enjoyed this video, or if you have feedback, please leave a comment down below, because I love to hear from you guys. Don't forget, if you want to stay up to date with the latest tutorial videos that I'm releasing, you can subscribe, and if you really enjoyed this particular video, hit that thumbs up button on the video. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you in the next one.